You think you know what poor looks like. You've seen it on a man's boots, in the rust on his truck, in the way he counts coins at the feed store like each one might be the last warm thing he owns. I thought I knew too. I'm a rancher. I've spent 61 years reading Dirt and Men, and I'd have bet my whole spread that Eli was the poorest soul in 3 counties. I was wrong about him in a way that still keeps me up some nights. This is the story of a woman who could have married money and married mud instead, and how the whole valley laughed behind her back while she did it. It's about what we found out the winter everything came apart, about the thing Eli was hiding out past the second ridge, the thing he'd have died before he showed any of us. I'm the one who saw it first. I'm the one who has to tell it right, because nobody else will, and because I owe him that much and more. Stay with me. By the end you'll understand why the richest man I ever knew never once had 2 dimes to rub together. And maybe you'll forgive us all a little, the way she did. The first time I understood I'd misjudged the whole situation, I was on my knees in 3 inches of half-frozen creek water, holding a calf's head out of the current, while a woman in a $500 coat had her bare arm shoulder-deep inside its mother. That's how it starts. Not at the beginning, I'll get to the beginning, give me a minute, but at the moment my own dumb certainty cracked down the middle like river ice in March. It was the 3rd week of February. Cold that gets into the seams of you. I'd come over to Eli's place because his old line phone had finally given up and he had no other way to call for help, so he'd done what he always did, which was the harder thing. He'd saddled up in the dark and ridden the 4 miles to my gate and stood there with his hat in his hands like a man asking to borrow money, which, knowing what I knew of him then, I half expected. "Walt," he said, "I got a heifer down, first calf. She's been at it 2 hours and there's a leg back. I keep a journal. Have done since my wife passed, 11 years now. It was her idea before it was a habit, something about getting the day out of my head and onto paper so I could sleep. That night I wrote 3 words before I rode out, and I can still see them in my own bad handwriting. Eli came. Trouble. I didn't write the 4th word I was thinking, which was broke, as in, this man is going to ask me for something he can't pay back, and I am going to give it because that is what neighbors do out here, and I am going to resent it the whole way over. I am not proud of that 4th word. I'm telling you so you understand the kind of fool I was. We rode back to his place under a sky so clear, and so crowded with stars it looked unfair, like somebody'd spilled a whole life's worth of luck up there where none of us could reach it. Eli didn't talk much. He never did. People in town read his quiet as slowness or pride, or that particular sullenness they liked to assign to him on account of his name and his face and his mother's people, who'd been on that land a long, long time before any deed got written about it. I'd done the same, once. Read his quiet wrong. It took me years to learn that Eli was the opposite of slow, that he was always listening, always a half step ahead, the way a man gets when the world has spent his whole life waiting for him to fail and he has decided, very calmly, not to give it the satisfaction. When we came over the last rise to his place I saw the truck. New. Or new enough, a clean white thing parked crooked by his sagging barn, headlights still on, driver's door hanging open like somebody'd left in a hurry. And I thought, well, here's the bank come to take it at last in the middle of the night, vultures that they are. It wasn't the bank. It was Clara Whitfield, standing in the wash of those headlights with her coat already off and her sleeves already pushed up, and when she turned to look at us I saw she had blood to the elbow and a look on her face like she'd been born for exactly this and had only just found out. Now, you need to understand who Clara was, and you need to understand it the way the Valley understood it, because the Valley's understanding is the whole engine of this thing. Clara Whitfield was the only daughter of Harlan Whitfield, who owned the bank, the grain elevator, a third of Main Street, and though he'd never say it out loud, most of the men who tipped their hats to him. The Whitfields were the closest thing our corner of the world had to royalty. Clara had gone away to school back east and come home a doctor, a real one, with letters after her name, and she could have hung a shingle in any city in the country. Instead, she came back to a place that had a single clinic and a doctor named Pell who was 3 years past when he should have quit, and she set up to help. People admired her for that. People will admire a rich man's daughter for almost anything, which is its own kind of poverty if you think about it. So when word got around, and word always gets around, faster than any phone line, that Dr. Clara Whitfield had been seen more than once out at Eli's place, the valley did what valleys do. It talked. It said she was slumming. It said she was lonely. It said her daddy would put a stop to it. It said worse things, things about Eli's people and Eli's dirt, and what a woman like that could possibly want with a man like that. A man who couldn't keep a fence up, who let his fields go to brush, who hadn't run more than a dozen scrub cattle in years and seemed, frankly, to be letting good land rot. That last part is what stuck in everybody's craw, not the romance, the waste. In ranch country, letting land go is close to a sin. We could forgive Eli for being poor. Poor is a kind of weather, it happens to anybody, but we couldn't forgive him for what looked like not even trying. His pastures went thick with chamisa and rabbit brush. His good bottomland by the creek sat empty year after year. Men who'd have helped him in a heartbeat if he just worked it watched him let it slide and decided he didn't deserve their help, and then felt righteous about deciding it. I was one of those men. I want that on the record. And here was Harlan Whitfield's daughter, brilliant, beautiful, with the whole world laid out for her like a Sunday table, choosing, over and over, in plain sight, the one man in the valley we'd all quietly agreed was a lost cause. The kindest thing anybody said about it was that she'd come to her senses. The cruelest I won't repeat, but I heard it said at the feed store by a man I'd known 40 years, and I heard myself laugh, and that laugh is another thing that keeps me up nights. But that's the valley's story. Let me get back to the creek, where the real one was happening while we weren't watching. Eli was off his horse before it had fully stopped, and the two of them moved around that down heifer like they'd done it 100 times together, which I'd come to learn they nearly had. Clara called out numbers, the calf's position, the mother's pulse, how long, how cold. Eli answered in that low, even voice, no panic in it, just work. He looked at me once. Walt, get under her head. Keep it up out of the water or she'll drown before the calf ever does. So that's how I came to be on my knees in that creek, holding a heifer's heavy head against my chest, while a doctor with a debutante's manicure had her arm inside a cow up to the shoulder, feeling in the dark and the cold for a leg that had folded the wrong way. Got it, Clara said. Her voice shook, but her hands didn't. Got the hock, Eli, when I say pull straight, not down straight. The heifer groaned, a sound that went all through her body and into mine where I held her. I felt her give up, and then I felt her decide not to. I don't know how else to say it. There's a moment with an animal that's been laboring too long where you can feel the choice happen to quit or to dig, and I felt that big, dumb, suffering creature dig, right there against my chest, and I'm not ashamed to tell you my eyes stung, and it wasn't the cold. Now, Clara said. And the calf came. In a rush, in a slick steaming flood that knocked Eli back on his heels in the water, and then it was lying there in the snow on the bank, this slimy black and white thing, not moving, and for one long second none of us breathed. Clara was on it, cleared its mouth with 2 fingers, rubbed at its ribs hard, harder, said come on, and then she did a thing I've never seen anybody do. She leaned down and blew, 2 short breaths, into that calf's nose and pulled back, and the calf's whole side heaved up like a bellows, and it shook its wet head, and it lived. She sat back in the snow. She was soaked to the skin, shaking so hard her teeth knocked. Blood and birth mess all up her arms and across that fine white blouse she'd ruined. And she laughed, this cracked, exhausted, wide-open laugh, and she looked over at Eli. And Eli looked at her. I want to tell you about that look, but I find I can't quite. I've been chewing on it for 3 years and the words won't come square. It wasn't the look of a poor man grateful to a rich woman. It wasn't gratitude at all. It was the look of a man watching someone do, freely and with her whole heart, the thing he had spent his entire lonely life doing in secret with nobody to see. It was recognition. It was a man who'd thought he was the last of his kind finding out, at 40-some years old, on the bank of a freezing creek, that he wasn't. I looked away from it, felt like I'd walked in on something I had no right to. And that's when I noticed the brand on the heifer, or rather I noticed there wasn't one. No brand, no ear tag, nothing. "Eli," I said, "whose cow is this?" He was getting the calf up against its mother, getting the heifer to her feet, and he didn't look at me when he answered. "Mine now," he said. "Found her in my creek bottom Tuesday, half dead. Somebody'd hauled her off and dumped her when she couldn't get up. Figured she'd calve and they didn't want the trouble." "Dumped her where?" "On my road." He got the heifer standing, steadied her. "They know I'll take 'em." I didn't understand that yet. "They know I'll take 'em." 4 words I'd turn over and over later until they finally cracked open. At the time I just filed it away as more of Eli being Eli, collecting other men's trash and calling it a herd. No wonder he was broke. We got the pair into his barn, into a stall thick with clean straw. I noted with some surprise. The man had no money, but his barn was kept like a church. Clara wrapped the calf in a blanket that, I realized later, was her own coat, the $500 one, never to be the same. Nobody mentioned it. Eli built up a fire in an old barrel stove and put coffee on, and we 3 stood around it steaming like horses, not saying much, and I caught myself watching them again. The small, easy way they moved around each other in that cramped, warm space, how she'd hand him a thing before he asked, and he'd already be reaching for it. It looked, I thought, like a marriage, long before it was one. "You'll catch your death," Eli told her. "Let me drive you back to town." "I have my truck." "You're shaking too hard to hold a wheel." "Eli," she wrapped both her cold red hands around her coffee, "I'm not going back tonight." And he went still, the way he did, and then he just nodded and got down another blanket. I made my excuses, felt the whole drive home like I'd glimpsed something true and hadn't been smart enough to read it. In my journal that night I wrote, "Calf lived. Clara W. there, no foolishness about her, real doctor's hands. Eli's barn cleaner than my house. Something off about that man, not the something town says." I underlined off. I just had the wrong idea about which direction off was. Here's what the Valley did next, because the Valley couldn't leave it alone. Word got out that Clara had spent the night. Of course it did. And the talk turned mean in a hurry, the kind of mean that wears a church-going face. Her name in mouths it had no business being in. And Harlan Whitfield, who'd been pretending not to notice his daughter's comings and goings the way powerful men pretend about anything they think they can still control, decided he'd noticed enough. I know what happened next because I was there for part of it, and because Clara told me the rest much later, on a porch in a different season when the worst was over, and we'd both earned the right to talk plain. Harlan called her into his study at the big house, told her she was making a fool of herself and of the family name, told her Eli was a deadbeat, a man who'd let good land go to ruin, a man with nothing and no prospect of nothing, and that the whole county was laughing. Told her, and this is the part Clara's voice still went flat over, years on, that he'd looked into Eli's accounts. A man with a bank can do that. And what he'd found was that Eli's place was mortgaged to the eyeballs, behind on everything, that money came in steady from somewhere and went right back out again into a hole Harlan couldn't see the bottom of, and that no man bled money like that unless he was a gambler, a drunk, or a crook. "Which is he, Clara?" her father asked her. "Because it's one of the 3, money doesn't just vanish." And Clara, who knew Eli didn't drink, didn't gamble, was the most honest man she'd ever met, found that she could not answer her father, because she didn't know either. She'd given her whole heart to a man, and there was a locked room in him she'd never been let into, a place his money went and his evenings went and sometimes whole days went, out past his second ridge where he'd asked her, gently and only once, please not to follow. She'd respected that. Love that doesn't respect a locked door isn't love, she told me, it's a search warrant. But sitting in her father's study, with the whole valley's laughter ringing in her ears and her own doubt rising up cold in her chest, Clara realized she had defended a man whose deepest secret she did not know. And that is a terrible thing to discover about your own faith in someone, that it has a floor you've never tested, and you don't know if it'll hold your weight. Find out where it goes, Harlan told her. Find out what he's hiding, and if you can look me in the eye after and tell me it's nothing shameful, I'll never say another word against him. He leaned back. He thought he'd won. But you won't be able to. Men don't hide good things, Clara. They only ever hide the bad. She drove out to Eli's the next evening meaning to ask him straight. She told me she rehearsed it the whole 4 miles of Washboard Road. Eli, I love you, but I need to know where the money goes. I need to be able to defend you with the truth and not just my heart. Fair. More than fair. But when she got there, his truck was gone and the house was dark, and there was a note pinned to the door under the porch light in his careful blocky hand, and it wasn't for her. It said, back late. If it's an emergency, the key's where it always is. If it's an emergency. For who? Who came out here, 4 miles from anywhere in the dark, looking for Eli, knowing his key's where it always is? She stood on that porch a long time. And then she did the thing she'd promised never to do, and she told me she'd never fully forgiven herself for it, even though it broke the whole thing open and saved more than she lost. She got back in her truck, and she didn't go home, and she didn't go inside. She drove out toward the second ridge. The track was bad, 2 ruts climbing through the chamisa, and her headlights swung wild over brush and rock. Her heart, she said, was sick in her, half of her praying she'd find nothing. The rancher's empty waste the valley swore was all there was, and the other half braced for the worst her father had promised. A still, a grow, a buried truth that would make a fool of her love. She came over the ridge. And below her, cupped in the long hidden valley between Eli's ridge and the mountains beyond, the worthless brush-choked bottom that everyone had written off, the land we'd all clucked our tongues over, there were lights. Not a few, many, warm yellow squares of window light scattered across the dark like the underside of those crowded stars, and the long, low shapes of buildings she'd never known were there, and wood smoke, and the small far sound of, she swore to this, of children. Of more than one child, laughing, somewhere down in that valley that wasn't supposed to hold anything at all. Clara turned off her engine. She sat in the sudden dark with her hands shaking on the wheel, exactly the way they'd shaken in the creek, and she understood 2 things at once. The first was that she had no idea, none, who the man she loved actually was. The second was that she was about to find out, and that there'd be no putting it back once she did. She opened the door and stepped out into the cold, and the valley breathed up at her, wood smoke and warmth and children, and somewhere down in all that light, a dog began, very clearly, to bark. She told me she walked down into that valley with her arms wrapped around herself, not for the cold, though it was cold, but to hold something in that felt like it might come loose. A doctor learns to keep her hands steady over the worst things a body can do to itself. Clara's hands were steady. It was the rest of her that wasn't. The track switched back twice and then leveled out, and the lights that had looked scattered from the ridge resolved into something with a shape to it. A cluster of buildings around a wide, flat yard. Long bunkhouse-looking things, low and solid, with smoke standing straight up from their pipes in the windless dark. A barn far bigger than the broke-down one by Eli's house, its big door open and yellow inside. Corrals, a lot of them, and movement in the corrals, horses, dozens of horses, more than Eli could have owned in 3 lifetimes at the rate the valley said he was failing. And the dog. A black ranch dog had come up the track to meet her, not barking anymore, just falling in at her heel the way a good dog does with someone it's decided is allowed. And that small thing, that the dog had decided she was allowed, undid her a little. She put a hand down and it pushed its head up into her palm and walked her in. The first person she saw was a boy. He couldn't have been 12. He was carrying a bucket across the yard, and he stopped dead when he saw her, this stranger, this woman in town clothes appearing out of the dark, and Clara watched something cross his face that she said she'd seen before only in the clinic, on the faces of children brought in by people who weren't their parents. A flinch that lived in the body, a readiness to be hurt that no 12-year-old should have had time to learn. "It's okay," she said. I'm a friend of Eli's." And the boy's whole frame changed at the name, loosened. "He's in the back barn," he said, "with the gray. She's foaling and it's bad." He looked at her town coat and made a child's quick calculation. "Are you the doctor?" He said. "Maybe a doctor might come someday. Are you her?" He said maybe a doctor might come someday. Clara told me she had to look at the ground for a second. "Yeah," she said, "I'm her. Show me." I'm going to step out of Clara's part of this for a minute, because there's things she didn't know that night that I had to dig up later, and you should have them now so the rest lands the way it ought to. That valley had a name, though no map carried it. Eli's mother's people called it something I won't try to spell, but it meant, near as anybody could put it in English, the place where the water doesn't leave. There's a spring down in there, a real one year-round, which in our country is rarer than gold and worth more. It had been a refuge for a long, long time before Eli, a place his mother's people came to when the larger world had decided they were in the way, which the larger world decided more than once and with guns. The land had been taken and retaken and signed away, and somehow, through a tangle of old allotments and a great-grandmother who would not sign, and a lawyer Eli's mother scraped together money to keep on for 30 years. A piece of it had ended up, against every probability, in Eli's name. He could have sold it. God, he could have sold it. The water alone, a developer offered him a number once that I happened to know, because Harlan Whitfield's bank brokered the offer, and the number had 6 figures in it, and Eli turned it down flat, which is the actual reason Harlan thought him a fool long before Clara ever came into it. A man turns down that kind of money for dirt. You decide he's simple or he's hiding something. Harlan decided both. What Eli was hiding was that he'd turned the place into exactly what it had always been, a refuge. It started the way these things do with one. A horse, a colt actually, that a man 2 valleys over was going to put down for being unbreakable, mean, ruined by handling. Eli took it for nothing and didn't break it so much as wait it out, 2 years of waiting, and that horse came around. Then another. Word travels in that world too. They know I'll take 'em. Eli became the man you hauled the hopeless ones to instead of the renderer. And he never charged, and he fed them on his good bottomland that everybody thought he was letting rot. Except it wasn't rot. It was being rested and rotated and grown for hay, just not for show, not for any eyes but his own. And then it stopped being only horses. The first child came with a horse, near enough. A foster placement gone bad, a boy who'd run, who'd been found half-starved sleeping in a stranger's barn with his arms around a sick pony's neck, and somebody who knew Eli, and Eli drove out in the dark and brought them both home, the boy and the pony, and didn't ask the questions the system asks. He just made a place, a bed, a meal, work to do, a horse to be needed by. And the boy got better the way the horses got better. By being waited out, by being somewhere the world had stopped trying to break him. By the night Clara walked down into it, there were 9 of them. Kids the county had given up on, and a couple the county didn't even know about. 2 old men, veterans, both, the kind that can't sleep indoors with walls all around and people too close, who'd been living rough until Eli gave them a valley and a job and the dignity of being needed by something. A woman and her 2 little ones who'd left a house in the night with bruises and nowhere to go. Eli took the money that came in from the few cattle and the hay and the handful of trained-around horses he sold to people he trusted, and every dollar of it went straight into the hole Harlan couldn't see the bottom of, into feed and firewood, and a doctor's bills and clothes for growing kids, and a propane tank, and a teacher he paid under the table to come twice a week. And into the lawyer, always the lawyer, keeping the land from slipping back into the world's hands. That was the hole. That was the gambling and the drink and the crookedness Harlan was so sure of. A grown man pouring his entire life, quietly, into people the rest of us had written off, and never once telling a soul because, and this is the part that took me longest to understand, because the moment it became known, it became vulnerable. A secret refuge can't be condemned, can't be inspected, can't be taken by a system that would scatter those kids back into the machine that broke them. The instant the Valley found out, the Valley could destroy it. So Eli let the Valley laugh. He let us call him a deadbeat and a waste and worse. He let the woman he loved sit in her father's study with no defense, because the alternative was risking 9 children and a spring, and the only safe ground his mother's people had left. He chose the laughter. Every single day he chose to be the poorest, most pitied man in 3 counties, so that the people in his valley could be safe. Now you know what Clara was walking into. She didn't yet. She found it out a foal at a time. The gray mare was down in the back barn, and it was bad, like the boys said. A bad presentation, the foal turned wrong, and one of the old veterans was in the stall with her doing what he could, which wasn't enough, and Eli was on his knees in the straw with his shirt off and his arms into the shoulder and his face gray as the mare. And when he looked up and saw Clara standing in the barn door, he didn't startle. He didn't say, "How did you find this?" or "You shouldn't be here." There was no room in him for any of that. There was only the dying mare. "Clara," he said, "thank God." And she went to her knees beside him in the straw and the blood in her town coat, and she put her hands where his couldn't reach, and they saved the mare together. Barely, it was close. It was the closest thing. And when the foal finally came and stood up on its absurd, long legs not 20 minutes later, slick and steaming and impossible, the whole barn full of people Clara had never met let out a breath at once, and a couple of the kids cried. And the woman with the 2 little ones laughed with her hand over her mouth, and Clara knelt there in the wreckage of her father's idea of her, and understood that she had stumbled into the realest thing she'd ever seen in her life. She looked at Eli. He was looking at her with his arms still bloody to the elbow, and there was no triumph in his face and no fear left either, just a kind of terrible nakedness. A man whose locked door has been blown open, and who's standing in the gap of it waiting to find out if the person on the other side is going to ruin him. "This is where it goes," he said quietly. He didn't have to say what it was. "All of it. This is the whole." He swallowed. "I was going to tell you, I swear I was. Every time I thought, if she knows, then she's carrying it too, and if it ever comes apart, it comes apart on her too, and I couldn't." He stopped. "I didn't want you to have to lie to your father." Clara said the thing she said next without planning it, and she said it was the truest thing she ever said in her life. "You absolute fool," she said. "I'd have lied to him gladly. I'd have lied to God." And then she started to laugh and cry at the same time, the way you do when something far too big has gotten into you and has to come out somehow. And she reached over and took his bloody hand in her bloody hand, there in the straw, in front of the children and the old soldiers and the battered young woman, and the laughing turned into the other thing. And Eli folded forward and put his head down against her shoulder and shook. This big, quiet man shook like the calf had shaken coming into the cold, and Clara held him the way she'd held the heifer's head out of the water. I wasn't there. I want to be clear, I wasn't there. But Clara told it to me with such care, years on, that I feel like I was, and I've come to think she gave it to me on purpose, handed me the memory like a thing to keep, because she knew I was the one who'd have to carry the whole story forward after, and she wanted me to carry the heart of it too, and not just the facts. For a while, a few months, the secret held, but bigger now, shared between the 2 of them. Clara still drove out to the clinic in town every day and was the bank king's brilliant daughter, and let the Valley believe she'd kept right on slumming. And in the evenings, she drove out the washboard road and over the ridge and down into the lights, and she doctored those kids and those old men for free, and she taught the woman's little ones their letters, and she fell so far in love with the whole impossible thing that her old life started to look like a coat that didn't fit anymore. She told her father she'd looked, and that there was nothing shameful, and that she couldn't say more. Harlan didn't believe her. A man like Harlan can't conceive of a hole that money falls into without somebody pocketing it on the way down. He thought she was protecting a crook out of foolish love, and he set about, in his patient banker's way, to save her from herself. He called the note. I should explain that for those who have never owed a bank. Eli's land carried a mortgage, the lawyer's fees, the propane tank, the lean years had all gone onto it, and a mortgage like that has terms. And somewhere in the fine print of every loan, a powerful man writes is a clause that lets him demand the whole thing, all at once, if conditions aren't met. Harlan found his clause. Found a missed filing, a technical default, something small enough that any decent banker would have let it slide, and any cruel one could hang a man on. And Harlan, who was not cruel exactly, but who had decided this was for his daughter's own good, hung Eli on it. The letter came in May. 60 days to pay the note in full or the bank would take the land. The whole number, the one with 6 figures in it, the one Eli didn't have and never would, because every dollar he ever touched went into the hole. 60 days to find the money or lose the valley, the spring, the buildings, the corrals, the only safe ground 9 children and 2 broken old soldiers and 1 fled-in-the-night family had in the entire world. And the cruelest part, the part Harlan could not have known and would not have cared about if he had, was that the developer's offer was still good. Eli could pay the note 10 times over by selling. All he had to do was hand the place where the water doesn't leave to a man who'd put houses on it, and scatter everyone in it back into the dark they'd come from. Sell the refuge to save the people, who'd then have no refuge, or keep the refuge and lose it to the bank and the people with it. There was no door in that room that didn't open onto the same loss. Eli read the letter standing in his clean, poor kitchen, and then he walked out to the ridge and sat looking down at the lights for most of a night. And Clara found him there at dawn and sat down beside him, and neither of them said anything for a long time, because there wasn't anything to say that wasn't a kind of dying. That's when Eli did the thing that started everything coming apart, and in the end, putting itself back together in a shape none of us could have drawn. He told Clara to go home. Not for good. He told her to go home and be the banker's daughter for one more night and let him handle it, and she, knowing him, knowing that voice, drove home with dread sitting on her chest like a stone, because she knew Eli, and she knew that a man who'd choose the world's laughter over his own pride for 9 years was a man entirely capable of choosing the world's loss over his own happiness. She knew he was going to sell. She knew he'd decided, sitting on that ridge, that the land could be replaced and the children couldn't, that he'd take the developer's money and buy them all somewhere else, somewhere with no spring and no history and no ghosts but at least a roof, and that he'd never tell them what it cost him, the way he never told anybody what anything cost him. She was wrong about which thing he'd decided, but she didn't find that out for 2 more days, and in those 2 days the secret finally broke loose of the valley altogether in the worst possible way. It broke loose because of a boy and a horse, which is fitting, since that's how it all began. The 12-year-old, his name was Marcus, the one who'd carried the bucket and flinched at strangers and asked if she was the doctor. Marcus took one of the half-wild horses out past the corrals in the gray of early morning, the day after Eli sat on the ridge, because he'd heard the grown-ups talking low the way kids always hear the things they're not meant to, and he understood enough to be terrified. And a terrified child who spent his life being moved against his will does the one thing he knows how to do. He runs. The horse threw him 3 miles out, in the rocks, in country with no road and no name, and broke him up bad, a leg, some ribs, a knock to the head, and the horse came back to the corral with an empty saddle, which is the oldest and worst sign there is. And here is where the secret died, because there was no hiding it now. A child was hurt and dying in the rocks, and saving him meant the one thing Eli had spent 9 years refusing. It meant calling the wider world. It meant the county. It meant a helicopter and a hospital and questions, so many questions, about who this boy was and where he'd come from, and why a child the system had a file on was living in a valley nobody knew existed, on land a poor rancher swore was empty. Eli didn't hesitate. I'll give him that, and it cost him everything, and he didn't hesitate for 1 second. He had Clara on the phone, the line was fixed by then, and Clara had the county on the line. And within the hour there was a helicopter beating down into the place where the water doesn't leave, into all those lights, and it carried Marcus out, and it carried the secret out with him, up over the ridge and into the open air where the whole valley could finally see. Clara rode in the helicopter with the boy. She told me his hand was so small in hers, and so cold, and that the whole flight she kept thinking, please, please, not like this. Don't let it be that the saving of him is the ruin of all of them. And she didn't know which of the two things she was praying hardest for, the boy's life or the valley's. And she said that not knowing was the worst feeling she'd ever carried, worse than the creek, worse than the gray mare, worse than anything. By nightfall the boy was stable, broken but stable, he'd live. And by nightfall the whole county knew, about the valley, the lights, the horses, the children no one had counted, the 2 old soldiers, the fled family, the spring. All of it, every secret thing Eli had bled himself white to keep hidden, was out in the open now, lying exposed under the same crowded unfair stars, with the bank's 60-day letter ticking down and a hospital full of questions, and a county full of people who'd spent 9 years calling Eli a deadbeat now driving out the washboard road, headlights swinging through the dark, coming to see the wasteland for themselves. I was one of those headlights. I want that on the record too. I drove out that night with the rest of them, and I came over the ridge, and I sat in my truck looking down at the lights with my hands gone still on the wheel, exactly the way Clara had, and I understood, the way you understand a thing all at once and far too late, what kind of man I'd been laughing at all these years. There's a thing that happens to a crowd when it finds out it's been wrong. I'd never watched it happen to a whole county before. I got to, that summer, and I'll tell you it isn't pretty and it isn't quick and it doesn't go the way you'd hope, and that's exactly why when it finally did turn, it meant something. The first week after the helicopter, the valley filled up with the wrong kind of attention. Not help, authority. The county sent people out, caseworkers with clipboards, a sheriff's deputy, a man from the state whose whole job seemed to be finding reasons a thing couldn't be allowed to exist. They walked through Eli's valley writing down everything that was out of code, and there was plenty. Because Eli had built it all in secret with his own 2 hands and no permits. On the theory, correct, as it turned out, for 9 years, that a thing nobody knew about couldn't be condemned. Now everybody knew. And the same county that had let those 9 children fall through its cracks in the first place stood in the warm yard of the place that had caught them and explained, with great patience, all the ways it was against the rules. I watched a caseworker tell the woman with the 2 little ones that her arrangement was unlicensed. I watched her go white. She'd run from a man who hit her, run with 2 bobbies into the dark, and the only safe floor she'd found in a year was about to be declared illegal by people who hadn't lifted a finger when she was sleeping in her car. Eli stood there and took it. He had a way of taking a thing, chin level, eyes steady, no fight in his shoulders but no give either, that I'd misread for years as a beaten man's slump, and now saw for what it was. It was a man absorbing a blow so the people behind him wouldn't have to. And the bank clock kept ticking. 60 days, and a week of it already gone to the hospital and the questions, and no money, and no way to get money that didn't end in the valley being emptied one way or the other. I went to see Eli on the 11th day. First time I'd ever gone to him for anything but to lend a hand on a dying cow. I found him out at the corrals at dusk, working a young horse on a long line, that black dog at his heel, and I stood at the fence a while before I could find the start of it. I owe you an apology, I said finally, for what I thought, for what I said. I made myself say the rest, for what I laughed at. Eli kept the horse moving, didn't look at me. You didn't know. That's not Eli, that's the thing. I didn't want to know. I had a man in front of me letting good land go, and I built a whole story about why instead of asking. Easier to pity a fella than to wonder if he's better than you. I gripped the rail. Town's the same, whole valley. We had it backwards about you for 10 years, and we were comfortable having it backwards. That's the part I can't. I quit. There wasn't a clean end to that sentence, and there still isn't. Eli brought the horse down to a walk, to a stop. Walked over and put his forearms on the rail next to mine, and we looked at the horse instead of each other, the way men do when the thing being said is too big to say to a face. Clara thinks I'm going to sell, he said, to the developer, take the money, pay the note, move everybody somewhere with a roof. He shook his head slowly. She thinks I decided that on the ridge. Did you? No, he was quiet a long moment. I decided I wasn't going to. That's the thing she's got wrong. I sat up there all night and I did the math every way there is, and selling saves the people and kills the place, and losing it to the bank kills both, and there's no third number. He turned his head and looked at me then, and there was something in his face I hadn't seen before, something that had been waiting 9 years to come out. And then about the time the sun came up I quit doing math. Because the math was the trap. Harlan and the developer and the county, they all think the same way. They think everything's a number and the only question is who pockets it. And I thought, no. This land taught my people the opposite thing for 200 years. The water doesn't leave. You don't sell the water to buy a cup. You stay and you let them take what they're going to take, and you stay anyway. He looked back at the horse. So that's what I decided. I'm not selling. If they want it, they can come take it off me with the kids watching, and they can explain to those kids why. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say to a thing that brave and that doomed. Trouble is, Eli said very low, I think that's the wrong answer. I think it's the only one I can live with, and I think it's still wrong because the kids don't need my principles. They need a bed. And I don't know how to be right and right at the same time. He pushed off the rail. First time in my life I've wanted somebody to tell me what to do, Walt. And there's nobody to ask. I drove home that night and I sat at my kitchen table with my journal, and I didn't write anything for a long while. Then I wrote one line. He's not going to sell. He's going to lose it standing up. And the whole county helped build the trap, and not one of us is helping spring it. And I sat there and looked at that line, an old widower at a table, and I thought about all the men I knew, all the headlights that had come out over the ridge to gawk. And I thought, we built it. Maybe we can be the third number. Here's what I did, and I'm not telling it to make myself out as anything. I was the one with the time and the standing is all. I'd ranched that valley 50 years and married into it and buried a wife in its churchyard, and when I talked, the old men listened, even when they shouldn't have. I started knocking on doors. I went first to the men I'd laughed with at the feed store, the ones who'd said the cruel things, and I made them come out and look. Not at the lights from the ridge, down in it, in the daylight, with the kids doing their chores and the old soldiers fixing fence, and the woman teaching her bobbies their letters at a table Eli had built. I made them stand in it. And I watched the same thing happen to them that had happened to me. The story they'd been comfortable with cracking down the middle, and underneath it the worse, better truth. You can't unsee a thing like that. You can decide not to act on it, plenty do, but you can't unsee it. And one by one, men who'd written Eli off started asking the only question that mattered, which was, what do we do? What we did was this. We couldn't outbid a developer. None of us had that kind of money. That's the whole point of ranch country. We're all of us one bad year from the bank ourselves. But there's a thing land can be, if you set it up right and you get the right people. That makes it impossible to sell and impossible to take and impossible to develop, forever. A thing called a trust, a conservancy, where the land's protected for what it is and what it does, and the value of it stops being a number a man can pocket. Clara knew the word. Eli's 30-year lawyer knew the machinery. What they didn't have was the one thing such a thing needs, which is a wall of people standing behind it, neighbors and names and signatures. Enough weight that the county can't just bulldoze it and the bank can't just swallow it. Because the whole valley is watching now, and the whole valley has decided this place gets to exist. We became the wall. It took the rest of the 60 days and it took everything. We had ranchers donating hay and hours and a feed store owner who'd said the worst thing of all standing up at a county meeting, read to his ears, and saying he'd been wrong and he'd put his own name on the paper. We had Clara working both worlds at once, the doctor and the daughter, until she hadn't slept in days. We had the lawyer doing the impossible with the trust. And we still came up short, because we always came up short out here. That's the condition of the place. And that's when the thing happened that I still can't fully account for. Harlan Whitfield paid the note. I have turned that over more times than any other piece of this, and I've never gotten all the way to the bottom of it, and I've decided I'm not meant to. People want their reversals clean. They want the cruel banker to weep and repent and become good. It wasn't that. Harlan Whitfield was the same hard man on the far side of it as the near. What happened, near as I can put together, is that Clara went to him, not as a doctor and not as a daughter pleading. She went to him with the trust papers and she laid them on his desk and she told him, and she told it to me later flat and dry, the way she told the hardest things. She told him that he had been right about one thing. That money doesn't just vanish. That she'd found out exactly where Eli's money went, every dollar of it for 9 years, and she made her father read the ledger of it. Not the bank's ledger. Eli's. The one with the propane and the feed and the teacher and the doctor's bills that were now her own bills, given free, and the lawyer, always the lawyer, and the 9 names of 9 children. She made the banker read where the money went. And then she said the thing that I think is the actual hinge of this whole story, more than the creek or the helicopter or the ridge. She said, "You told me men only ever hide the bad things. You were wrong, and I think some part of you has always known you were wrong, because you've spent your whole life hiding the one good thing you ever did and being ashamed of it." And she named it. I don't know what it was. She never told me and I never asked, and I'd guess it was some old quiet kindness Harlan had done decades back and buried under all that hardness, because kindness, to a man like that, is a weakness to be hidden, the same as it was to Eli. Except Eli built a valley out of his and Harlan built a vault. Harlan paid the note. He never said why. He did it cold through the bank like a transaction. And he never once came out to the valley and never once shook Eli's hand and never, to my knowledge, said a soft word about any of it. He gave his daughter the money to save the man he despised, and he did it in a way that let him pretend it wasn't love, which I have come to think was the only way he knew how to love anything, and which is its own kind of poverty, maybe the deepest one in this whole story. The note was paid, the trust held. The county, with the whole valley now standing behind it and a banker's name no less on the paper, found that its rules had a great deal more give in them than they'd had 2 months before. The woman's arrangement got licensed. The old soldiers got to stay. The valley, the spring, the lights, the place where the water doesn't leave was put beyond the reach of any number. Forever, in the name of a trust whose first trustee was a poor rancher, and whose second was a doctor who'd given up an inheritance to be poor with him. They married that fall, out in the valley in the yard, with the horses watching over the corral rails and the kids in their best clothes and the 2 old soldiers standing up as witnesses and the black dog asleep in the sun. I gave Clara away since her father wouldn't come, though I'll tell you he sent a thing, a deed, it turned out, to a little parcel adjoining the valley, the missing piece that squared off the whole spring. No note with it. Just the deed and his signature, the same signature that had called the note that nearly killed the place. Make of that what you will. I've made everything of it I can. The boy lived. Marcus. He healed up crooked in one leg and walks with a hitch, and he's 19 now, and he runs the horse program down in that valley, the unbreakable ones, the ruined ones, the way Eli taught him, by waiting them out, by being the one safe thing in their world long enough that they decide the world might be safe. He told me once, when he was about 16 and full of the kind of fury healing boys get, that he was the reason it all almost came apart, that if he hadn't run off and broke himself, the secret would have held and the bank would never have, and I stopped him. I said, son, if you hadn't run, that note would have come due anyway, and Eli would have lost it quiet, alone, with nobody knowing to help. You didn't break it. You broke it open. There's a difference, and you'll understand it when you're old. He didn't believe me. They never do at 16. But he stayed, and he kept the horses, and last spring he brought in a colt 3 counties over had given up on, mean and ruined and unbreakable, hauled it down into the valley himself, and I drove out to watch him work it on the long line at dusk with a black dog's grandpup at his heel, and I had to go sit in my truck for a while. Eli's older now. We both are. His hair's gone the gray of that mare's, and he moves slower in the cold, and the valley's got more in it than it ever did. Kids grown and gone and writing back. Kids come new, a clinic now where Clara doctors free, a proper schoolroom, a name on a map finally in a language the map had to learn how to spell. The water still hasn't left. I asked him once if it ever scared him, all those years, holding it alone, letting us all think he was nothing. He thought about it the way he thinks about everything, long, with the horse in his eye, and not me. Every day, he said, but I'll tell you a thing, Walt, the being thought poor, that part I could have carried forever, wasn't even hard after a while. He almost smiled. It was the not being known. That's the only part that ever near broke me. A man can be poor his whole life and stand it fine. It's being unseen that kills you. And then he didn't say anything else, and neither did I. And we stood at the rail and watched the light go down over the valley, full of the lives he'd saved by letting the world believe he'd saved nothing. I went home and I wrote it in my journal, the last real entry I ever made about all this, and then I closed the book on it for good, or thought I did, until you asked me to tell it. I'll give you the line I wrote, since you've come this far, and then I'm done. The richest man I ever knew. We none of us could see it, and that was the price of admission, and he paid it for 9 years so a house full of throwaway kids could sleep safe, and the only thing he ever wanted in return he didn't get until a woman in a ruined coat walked down into his valley and saw him. Just saw him. That was the whole fortune. That was the hidden world. It was never the land or the spring or the secret.